Imagine finding an old flashlight. You open it expecting corroded batteries but find nothing. You'd toss it, right? But what if, in your basement, you picked it up again? And a beam of light sliced through the darkness, a light that shouldn't exist. This is the story of a flashlight that defies physics. It terrified a town, baffled experts, and made witnesses question their sanity. The light it produced seemed to reveal things never meant to be seen. How can it produce light with no power source? It was a tangible piece of the impossible. This is the story of that flashlight, a story that asks, what if the darkness isn't empty, and something is hiding in it? Our story begins in the forgotten halls of Northgate High, a school shut down for over a decade. Urban explorers dared to sneak inside, telling stories of strange noises. In 2022, the town council decided to demolish the school. A clean-out crew was sent in. In the old locker bay, a worker named Dave found something unusual. Locker 734 was stuck, rusted shut. With a crowbar, Dave pried it open. Inside, a layer of dust and a black plastic flashlight. It didn't seem special. He picked it up. A useless, empty object. He tossed it into his bag and forgot about it. He had unearthed a mystery. The flashlight was unremarkable, made of cheap black plastic, the kind you might find in a dollar store. There was no brand name, no markings. It was completely anonymous. It was completely hollow inside. Dave took the flashlight home. He tried putting batteries in it, but they just rattled around inside. It was functionally useless. Later that night, a storm knocked out the power. He pulled out the flashlight. He slid the switch forward. A bright white circle of light shot out. He stood frozen in shock. It was brighter than any flashlight should be. It was still empty. This was something impossible. Dave stood in the darkness. The flashlight cut a clean circle on the wall. It was impossible. He clicked it off. Darkness swallowed him. He clicked it back on. His wife, Sarah, was lighting candles. She gasped, pointing at the flashlight. "How is that thing working?" she asked. He unscrewed the cap, showing her the empty tube. Then the front, revealing the hollow cone. Sarah stared, eyes wide. That can't be," she whispered. They spent the next hour in disbelief. The storm raged outside. The initial shock curdled into fear. It felt unnatural, wrong. Dave thought back to the abandoned school. He had a chilling thought. Maybe the object had been waiting in the dark, letting it out into the world. The next morning the storm had passed. Dave pulled the flashlight from his tool bag. It looked normal, innocuous. He slid the switch forward. Nothing happened. Maybe it had been a fluke. But Sarah wasn't convinced. "Try it in the closet," she suggested. In the dark closet, the flashlight worked perfectly. But the moment any light spilled in, the flashlight's beam vanished. It had rules. It needed darkness to create light. This discovery only deepened the mystery. They were beginning to feel they were in over their heads. After days of tests, Dave needed an outside perspective. He needed a skeptic. He called his best friend Mark, a science teacher. He said he'd found something at the old school site. Mark arrived, Dave presented the flashlight and explained the story. Mark listened skeptically, examined it, and shook it. "It's a toy," he said. Dave said, "Come with me." He led Mark to the basement and switched off the light. He clicked the flashlight. The basement was illuminated. Mark gasped, speechless. He saw the light came from an empty shell. "This is breaking the second law of thermodynamics," he stammered, filled with excited disbelief. It was something that should not exist. The secret was now shared. Dave, Sarah, and Mark spent hours in the basement. Mark tried to measure the light, but his instruments gave nonsensical readings. For a while they felt like pioneers charting unknown territory, but that feeling wouldn't last. The flashlight had another secret. Sarah saw something moving inside the light on the wall. It was a flicker, a distortion. A shadow was taking shape. It looked vaguely human, but its proportions were wrong. It was a shadow with no object to cast it. A bone-deep chill settled over them. This was no longer a scientific puzzle. It seemed to reveal things hidden in the darkness. They felt like they were being observed. The terror had just begun. Mark, the voice of reason, was now a man obsessed. The flashlight became his focus, a puzzle that consumed him. He kept it safe in his school's lab. At night he locked himself in the windowless chemical storage room, a place of absolute darkness, and delved into the impossible. He subjected the object to tests. The results were maddeningly inconsistent. The light had no heat signature, a violation of energy conservation. It was a physical paradox eroding Mark's sanity. His world had been shattered by a cheap piece of black plastic. The flashlight simply worked, without explanation. The more he failed to explain it, the more sinister it felt. The weight of that knowledge was beginning to crush him. The most disturbing element was what the light revealed: shadowy figures appearing frequently. In the science lab, Mark witnessed spectral forms moving within the light like recordings of people no longer there. He theorized the flashlight was a projector, showing echoes of past events imprinted on the place. The implications were horrifying, moments of past tragedy replayed. One night, he saw a clear figure, a student looking directly at him. The echo seemed aware, shattering the illusion of safety. It was interactive, and it knew he was there. Mark's frantic calls to Dave and Sarah became more frequent and more unhinged. He would describe the figures, the impossible readings, his wild theories about temporal echoes and interdimensional windows. Dave, who had been relieved to get the object out of his house, was now growing deeply concerned for his friend's mental state. He and Sarah urged Mark to get rid of the flashlight, to just throw it away and forget about it. But Mark refused. He was convinced he was on the verge of a breakthrough, that he alone could solve the puzzle. He felt a sense of ownership, of responsibility for the impossible object. Inevitably, the secret began to leak. Mark, in his exhausted state, became careless. He mentioned the impossible light to a trusted colleague in the science department, hoping for a fresh perspective. The colleague, intrigued and concerned, mentioned it to his wife. Soon, a distorted version of the story began to circulate among the high school staff. A story about a strange flashlight found in the old building. A flashlight that could show you ghosts. The whispers started as a joke, a piece of local gossip. But stories, like shadows, have a way of growing and taking on a life of their own in the dark. The rumors found fertile ground in a town already full of stories about the abandoned Northgate High. People began to connect the flashlight to old legends about the school. Tales of a student who vanished in the 70s, of a janitor who died under mysterious circumstances. The flashlight wasn't just a weird object anymore. It was becoming the focal point for decades of local fear and superstition. It was a tangible piece of evidence for every ghost story ever told about the school. The narrative was slipping out of Dave's and Mark's control, morphing into a town-wide myth. Students started hearing the rumors from their parents and older siblings. The story of the ghost light of Northgate became a popular topic of conversation in the hallways of the new high school. It was spooky, it was exciting, and it felt real because it was tied to a specific object that a teacher supposedly had. The quiet mystery shared between three people was exploding into a public spectacle. They had tried to keep the impossible light contained, but they had failed. Now, the entire town was starting to look into the darkness, wondering what might be looking back. The flashlight's notoriety grew, terrifying Dave and Sarah, who felt responsible. Dave confronted Mark, demanding the flashlight back. Mark, looking pale, refused, clutching the flashlight. "It's showing us what's always here," he whispered, "the things that live in the spaces between." The flashlight had taken hold of Mark's mind. Their argument escalated. A security guard interrupted them. Dave left, defeated. The flashlight was now an obsession, its influence growing. Mark claimed the shadowy figures were becoming clearer, whispers audible. The flashlight felt active, asserting itself, entangling itself deeper. Picking it up now seemed a monumental mistake. Dave felt dread. The flashlight was parasitic, attached to Mark, an entity wanting to be seen. The light illuminated a darkness in the human mind. It was an unwanted guest with no intention of leaving. The apparitions began to change, becoming clearer. Mark documented these changes with chilling precision in the school laboratory. The figures were gaining substance, becoming more detailed. The line between memory and presence blurred. Their movements seemed more aware. Sometimes a figure stared directly at him. This shattered his theory. An echo doesn't react or stare back. The most terrifying change was their interaction with the environment. A shadowy hand drew a line through dust on a chalkboard. The line remained, physical proof from an intangible entity. The barrier between worlds was breaking down. The unseen was starting to touch. Mark spiraled further into obsession and terror. He wrote that the light was a bridge, allowing entities to impose their reality. It showed beings existing concurrently, on a frequency only the light could tune into. The breaking point came one Tuesday night. Mark, fueled by coffee and curiosity, had been in the lab for over 36 hours. He set up a camera, hoping to capture proof of the apparitions. The figures appeared, but then, a new, darker figure emerged. It moved with a predatory confidence, making the air heavy and cold. Mark felt a primal fear. The figure raised its head. It had no discernible face, but Mark felt it was looking at him. A guttural sound emanated from the air. The camera flickered, it pointed directly at him. He flipped the light switch. The figure vanished. The footage dissolved into static. The flashlight hadn't just shown him terror, it prevented him from proving it. Shaken, Mark fled the school, leaving the flashlight behind. As he left, Mr. Henderson, the school janitor, startled him. "You've been messing with something you shouldn't be," Henderson rasped. "I see your light. It's the same kind of light." He told Mark about a reclusive student from 30 years ago at the old Northgate High. The student carried a black flashlight that supposedly pulled light from the dark. Henderson saw him shining the light at locker 734. Figures moving within the beam. The boy threw the flashlight in the locker, slammed it shut, and ran, never to be seen again. That light doesn't just show you what's there, it calls to it. You opened a door that boy was smart enough to close. The pieces clicked into place. The flashlight had a history and he had just repeated it. The story of the flashlight was now a roar. Mark's flight from the school, witnessed by the janitor, sparked public speculation. Mr. Henderson shared his 30-year-old story with staff, and it spread like wildfire. The tale now had a backstory involving a mysterious student who vanished. The flashlight wasn't just haunted, it was a cursed artifact. Parents called, demanding answers. The local newspaper ran a sensationalized piece. Northgate's phantom flashlight. The flashlight became a legend, the heart of the town's paranoia. Teenagers dared each other to sneak onto school grounds. Dave and Sarah found themselves at the center of unwanted attention. The legend was far more entertaining than the truth. Once a story like this gets out, you can't control it. The narrative belonged to the town. Worried about Mark, Dave and Sarah decided to intervene. After days of unanswered calls, they drove to Mark's. They found him in his darkened living room, a shadow of his former self. The flashlight had broken him. They sat with him, trying to pull him back to reality. Slowly, Mark began to describe his terrifying experience. Dave pleaded, "We have to get rid of it, it's a trap. We need to destroy it, we need to close the door." The flashlight wasn't just a light, it was consuming him. Mark finally understood he couldn't win. He agreed. They had to end this. The three would return to the school, retrieve the flashlight, and destroy it. The escalating chaos was no longer something the town officials could ignore. The sensational newspaper article and the flood of calls to the high school had pushed the story from local gossip into an official problem. The school board, under pressure from concerned parents, called an emergency meeting. They needed to address the rumors head-on and deal with the object at the heart of it all. The town's police chief, a no-nonsense man named Frank Miller, was brought in to retrieve the flashlight and conduct a formal investigation, if only to quell the rising public hysteria. Chief Miller, accompanied by the school principal, entered the now infamous science lab with a sense of weary duty. They found the flashlight exactly where Mark had left it, sitting innocently on a metal lab table. Miller picked it up, feeling its strange lightness. He clicked the switch in the brightly lit room and of course nothing happened. He unscrewed it, saw the hollow interior, and let out a sigh of frustration. To him, it was just a broken toy, a piece of junk that had somehow become the boogeyman for the entire town. He saw it as a symbol of mass delusion, not a supernatural artifact. He took the flashlight back to the police station, logging it into evidence as unidentified plastic object. He intended to write a simple report, dismiss the case as a prank, and urge the newspaper to print a retraction. But his curiosity got the better of him. Late that night, long after the other officers had gone home, he took the flashlight into the station's windowless evidence locker. He closed the heavy metal door, plunging the room into absolute suffocating darkness. With a click, he slid the switch forward. The room was instantly filled with a brilliant, cold light, and Chief Miller's steadfast skepticism was violently shaken. He stood there for a long moment, the impossible beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating shelves of evidence bags. He was a man who had seen a lot in his career, but nothing had prepared him for this. This wasn't a trick, it wasn't a prank, it was real. He quickly switched it off, his heart pounding faster than he would ever admit. He suddenly understood that this was not a simple case he could close with a dismissive report. The town's fear might be exaggerated, but he now knew with unnerving certainty that it wasn't entirely baseless. With the police now officially involved and in possession of the flashlight, the story reached a new level of legitimacy. The school board, hoping to find a rational explanation that would calm the public, decided to bring in outside experts. They contacted a physics professor from a nearby state university, a woman named Dr. Eris Thorne, known for her work in optics and her occasional side job debunking paranormal claims. She agreed to examine the object, intrigued by the police chief's unusually shaken, off-the-record description of what he had witnessed in the evidence locker. She arrived expecting to uncover a clever hoax. Dr. Thorne conducted her examination in a controlled university laboratory, a place far removed from the superstition and fear brewing in the town. She used equipment far more sophisticated than anything Mark had access to. Yet, her results were bafflingly the same. In any lit environment, the flashlight was inert. In a specially designed light-proof chamber, it produced a powerful beam from no discernible source. It registered no heat, no electromagnetic field, no radiation. It was, from a scientific standpoint, a complete and utter impossibility. Dr. Thorne, the professional skeptic, found herself without an explanation. The university released a preliminary statement which was meant to be reassuring but had the opposite effect. It stated that the object exhibits anomalous properties that cannot be explained by current scientific principles and that further study is required. This vague academic language was gasoline on the fire of the town's paranoia. Cannot be explained was interpreted by the public as supernatural. The experts, the voices of reason, had essentially shrugged their shoulders. Science had failed to provide a comforting answer, leaving a vacuum that was quickly filled by fear and wild speculation. The incident created a stark divide in the community. On one side were those who, like Chief Miller initially, clung to the idea that there had to be a trick. They argued it was a high-tech prank, perhaps involving some new form of wireless power transfer that the scientists just hadn't figured out yet. On the other side were the growing number of people who believed the janitor's story, who felt the flashlight was something ancient and malevolent. The debate raged in coffee shops, on local forums, and over dinner tables. The town was no longer just afraid, it was fractured by the impossible object. With no rational explanation forthcoming, the fear in the town began to metastasize, growing into a full-blown paranoia that touched every corner of the community. People started seeing things in the dark. A flicker of movement in a darkened hallway, a shadow in the corner of their eye. Every normal trick of the light was now interpreted as a sign that the flashlight's influence was spreading. The apparitions that Mark had seen in the lab were no longer confined to that space. In the minds of the townspeople, they were now everywhere, lurking just beyond the reach of the light. The old Northgate High, already slated for demolition, became a place of intense dread. Construction workers hired to begin the preliminary clearing of the site reported tools going missing, and strange cold spots inside the building. Several quit, spooked by the building's newfound reputation. Parents forbid their children from going anywhere near the school grounds. The building was no longer just an abandoned structure, it was seen as a contaminated zone, the source of a plague of fear that was infecting everyone. The flashlight might have been in a police locker miles away, but its spiritual home was still locker 734. The psychological toll was immense. Local therapists reported an uptick in patients complaining of anxiety and insomnia. People became jumpy, suspicious of the dark in a way they hadn't been since childhood. The story of the flashlight had tapped into a primal fear of the unknown, and with every passing day that it remained unexplained, that fear grew deeper roots. The town's collective imagination ran wild, crafting elaborate mythologies around the object, connecting it to every unsolved disappearance and strange event in the county's history. The flashlight was becoming the answer to every question that had no answer. This communal anxiety began to turn ugly. People started looking for someone to blame. Mark, who had gone into seclusion, was treated like a pariah, the man who had unleashed this curse. Dave and Sarah received anonymous, hostile phone calls accusing them of bringing this trouble to the town. The fear was curdling into anger and suspicion, directed at the very people who had first encountered the object. The town was not just afraid of the flashlight anymore, they were becoming afraid of each other, wondering who might be susceptible to its dark influence. The situation had become untenable. The school board, the town council, and the police department were all under immense pressure to do something, anything, to restore a sense of normalcy. The scientific investigation had been a bust, only adding to the panic. The police chief was unwilling to simply destroy the object, feeling it was a piece of evidence in a situation he no longer understood, yet he didn't want it in his station a moment longer. The flashlight had become a hot potato, an artifact so steeped in fear and controversy that no one wanted to be responsible for it. A final, tense town hall meeting was called. It was a chaotic affair, with frightened and angry citizens shouting over one another. Some demanded the flashlight be destroyed, melted down, or smashed to pieces. Others, caught up in a different kind of fervor, argued it should be preserved and studied, that it was a miracle. A small, fervent religious group claimed it was a demonic artifact that needed to be exorcised. The meeting devolved into a shouting match, perfectly illustrating the deep divisions and high emotions the flashlight had caused. It had truly put the town in a state of fear. Finally, the school board president, a weary-looking woman named Martha Gable, made a decision. She declared that the flashlight was, officially, property of the old Northgate High School district. And since the school was being demolished, its contents were to be disposed of. She announced that the object would be permanently disposed of in a way that would ensure it could not be retrieved. The plan was vague, but the intention was clear. They were going to make the flashlight disappear, hoping the town's fear would disappear along with it. This decision was met with a mixture of relief and trepidation. For many, it felt like the only solution. They had to excise the object from their community like a tumor. But for Dave, Sarah, and a now recovering Mark, who watched the meeting from home, the decision felt ominously familiar. They remembered the story of the student who tried to get rid of it by locking it away. They knew that the flashlight had a history of resisting attempts to be contained or forgotten. The town believed they were ending the story, but Dave and his friends feared they were just setting the stage for the next, perhaps more terrifying chapter. Following the town hall's decision, Police Chief Miller took responsibility for disposing of the cursed object. He decided to destroy it with fire at the town's incinerator. Miller reasoned nothing could survive the furnace's extreme temperatures. Late one night, he and two officers drove the flashlight to the facility, hoping to avoid public attention. Wearing protective gloves, the chief tossed the flashlight into the roaring inferno. The operator sealed the door, and the relieved officers watched, convinced it was done. The next morning, Miller walked into his office, ready to close the case. He sat down, took a sip of coffee, and froze. Sitting on his desk, next to his family photo, was the flashlight, pristine and undamaged. His office had been locked, the station secure. A cold dread washed over him. It had come back. The return of the flashlight sent a shockwave of panic. If fire couldn't destroy it, they needed a different approach. The town council president, Martha Gable, proposed they sink it in Black Lake. A grim party was assembled. Chief Miller, Martha Gable, and Dave. They took a small boat to the center of the vast lake. They placed the flashlight inside a heavy canvas bag filled with rocks. With a shared, grim look, he let it go. The bag plunged into the dark water with a heavy splash, disappearing from sight. They returned to shore feeling a fragile sense of hope. Just after midnight, Dave was jolted awake by a dripping sound from his kitchen, and there, sitting in a puddle of dark, murky lake water, was the flashlight. It had found its way back. The group's last hope was old superstition burying the flashlight at a crossroads, far from town. Under a full moon, Dave, Mark, Chief Miller, and Henderson dug deep, placing the flashlight in a lead-lined box at the intersection's center. The earth was packed tight, the ritual completed in tense silence. For a week, nothing happened. Relief settled in. Maybe the nightmare was over. But the peace was fragile. The town's fear faded, but the flashlight was only waiting. It was patient. It would return. A week later, demolition began at Northgate High. The town exhaled. Then a package arrived at Town Hall for Martha Gable. No return address. Inside, the flashlight caked in Crossroads dirt and a note, "You can't get rid of me. I belong here." Terror swept the town. The object wasn't just returning, it was communicating. The failed attempts had angered it. Now the town feared the flashlight itself. No one knew what it would do next. The story was far from over. The flashlight sat in an evidence bag on Chief Miller's desk, the town paralyzed by dread. No one dared touch it. They simply waited. On the fourth morning, it vanished. No broken seal, no open window, no sign of entry. The bag was empty. The flashlight was gone. The impossible disappearance left only silence. The object had made its point, then slipped away. The town was left with questions and fear. Life resumed, but the town was changed. The school was gone, but the story lingered. A scar beneath the surface. People tried to forget, but unease remained. Those closest to the events withdrew, forever altered. The legend became a warning, a local myth. The community survived, but innocence was lost. Even in daylight, the shadow of the flashlight remained. The flashlight was gone, but its presence lingered. People reported phantom lights in the woods and on bedroom walls, brief, Inexplicable, terrifying. These sightings became the new folklore, Northgate echoes. The town learned some mysteries never end. The flashlight had broken more than laws of physics. It had broken their certainty. Its legacy was fear of the unknown. Sometimes the darkness is anything but empty. The story ends with questions, not answers. The flashlight vanished, leaving only legend and fear. Was it a hoax, a haunting, or something else? The town was forced to accept the limits of understanding. The tale lingers, a warning in the night. Next time you find an old flashlight, you might hope it doesn't work. Because if it does, you'll never know what you might see in the dark.